Often, especially when you have delicate fabrics, your collar pieces tend to stretch out while you're handling it because a lot of the curved part that you cut is cut on the bias. So what I like to do is when my fabric pieces are all cut out, I save the piece that I'm going to cut the collar out of. Then I put the fabric right sides together and I make sure that there's enough space for both pairs of collar, a mirror image of each other. And then I interface the top piece of fabric on the wrong side, so when it's all laid out, it's ready to cut and pin all at the same time without me having to separate the pieces or handle them. We are also going to be sewing the collar with the interfacing facing upwards at the machine, so this is all already orientated in the right way. So I'm just going to cut out both pairs of collar pieces, making sure that they are mirror image pairs, one for the right side and one for the left side of the garment. And then without moving either of those pieces, I'm going to pin it in place, pinning the longer curved edge. Now we're going to sew that edge at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Now there's a difference between clipping and notching your seam allowance when it comes to curve. We have a concave curve and a convex curve. We will be handling both of these curves in this pattern, so I'm doing a little sample here to demonstrate why we notch or why we clip. As you can see with this convex curve, when I turn it right sides out, then it has too much seam allowance for the seam, so you can see it's all bunched up, and that is why we clip. So when we clip little notches into it, it's little triangular pieces, the seam allowance is going to be less and it's going to take up less space inside, so it won't be bulky and bulging. If you have a very delicate fabric, you might want to make 2 lines of stitching just to reinforce it, but you're going to just clip right up until and not through the stitching. When the light shines through it, you can see it fits perfectly flat inside. Now the opposite goes for a concave curve. So there's not enough seam allowance in order for the curve to lie flat. So you can see there's lots of tension there. And to be able to release that tension, we're going to just clip it. So you just make little snips with your scissors, again right up until the seam line, but not through the stitches. Now you can see we've released all of that tension, and when we press the seam, it has none of that tension and it can lie flat as it should. So now, keeping all of that in mind, we're working with a convex curve, which is the outer long edge of the collar pieces. We're going to reduce the seam allowance just to reduce the bulk in the seam, reduce it by about a half or a third, and then you can clip little notches all the way along the outer edge of the collar. This is going to allow, as we saw earlier, for the seam allowance not to bulk up when we turn it right sides out. Now what I like to use, which makes this process very quick and easy, and it does both steps in one, which is trimming the seam allowance and cutting the notches, and that is simply by using a pinking shears. You can just do it really close to the stitching edge, and as you can see, that makes a series of notches and it helps the seam allowance to lie nice and flat. The pinking shears also prevents the fabric from fraying. My fabric doesn't need this, but just for demonstration purposes, I've made another line of stitching just to show you how you could reinforce it if your fabric needed it. Now we're going to turn the collar pieces right sides out and we're going to press it. So when you press it, the seam line is going to be just on the inside of the undercollar, so that the top collar is nice and smooth and there's no seam line showing. The top collar is the interfaced side and the undercollar is the uninterfaced side. As you press this, you're going to find there's a little bit of excess fabric on the undercollar side because you are pressing the seam line towards the undercollar and not right in the middle of the two. So you're just going to ease in that excess little bit of fabric with the steam from your iron. The steam will just help this fabric to mold into shape to fit underneath the upper collar. And then you can give it one final press and steam from the right side. Now you're going to notice there's an extra little lip of fabric sticking out from the undercollar, and that's because we rolled the seam line in towards the undercollar. So we're just going to trim that little piece of fabric off so that the undercollar stays in place and the seam line stays where it's meant to be. Place your vetiver top with right sides out and the front facing you. Then take your collar pieces, put the front at each front edge with the under collar touching the right side of the garment and the upper collar facing up. Now we're going to pin the collar neck edge to the garment neck edge, and we're going to start by putting the front of the collar right up against the button placket that was folded over previously. Then we're going to match the shoulder notch in the collar with the shoulder seam. And then we're going to take the back point of the collar and match it up with the notch we made. Now take each section and matching the neck edges, pin it in place. We're now going to baste the collar in place before we sew on the binding. So I'm moving my needle position. I'm putting the edge of the presser foot to the edge of the neckline, which would usually be a 1/4 inch with my needle in the middle, but I'm moving my needle closer to the edge of the fabric so that it's a scant 1/4 inch. And then this will be able to be within the seam allowance and it won't show on the right side. This is just basting, so if you wanted to, you could use a longer stitch length over here. Starting right at the edge of the button placket, we're going to work our way all around the whole collar, right to the other edge of the button placket. I'm just using a different color here so it's very obvious. Take the right side of the binding and you lay it onto the garment. So the wrong side is facing up to you. Then you can just take it at the center front line, about 1 centimeter in from the edge, and we're going to start the binding there. Now I'm going to move my needle position back in place so that it's back into the center, because I want a full 1/4 inch seam allowance now. And this is going to be the permanent seam of our binding. So back stitching right to the edge. I'm going to pull ever so slightly on the binding, only enough for it to conform to the edge of the neckline. Stop stitching just before or at where you want the binding to end, and then you can snip off the rest. You can lift up your presser foot if you need to with your needle down, and then you're going to stitch right to the edge of the button plackets. So we are working with a concave curve being the neckline, so we're going to snip the seam allowances. This will allow it to lie nice and flat without tension when we want to top stitch. So because we've got so many seam allowances here, for a smoother look on the right side, we're going to take one seam allowance. I'm taking the binding and snipping it, and then I'm snipping the bottom seam allowances together, alternating where I snipped the binding. Press the binding and the seam allowance away from the garment so that the binding lies nice and crisp and flat at the seam line. Take your binding and fold it over so that it's snug at the edge of the neckline. So as you can see, it's just going to have the neckline seam allowance amount that the binding is covering, and it's flush with the neckline. And then at the back there's going to be excess, which after we've understitched, we're going to trim that away. Just take the pressing in sections, so do one front section, then a back section, and then the other front section, so it lies nice and flat each section as you press it. A tailor's ham is very handy for this because it helps with working with the curves. Now we're going to understitch the binding, which means we're stitching very close to the seam edge on the binding side. And as we're doing this from the right side, we will also be catching the longer binding seam allowance on the wrong side so that it's caught in place, so that it makes for much easier top stitching when we top stitch the binding in place. Trim away the excess binding at the wrong side as close to the stitch line as you can. This is going to all be concealed once we top stitch the binding in place. So as you can see, when we turn over the binding for top stitching, it's going to conceal that raw edge. When you've continued sewing your vetiver top and you get to the part where you need to do the top stitching, you're going to turn the corners of your button plackets right way out, and then you're going to see the binding wants to naturally fold in place towards the wrong side of the garment. Take a point turner or any tool that you use for this purpose and turn out the points so that they're nice and crisp, and then you press that in place. So when you're doing your top stitching as per the normal vetiver top instructions, when you get to the binding, you're going to top stitch it just as you would a normal neck binding, but you're going to be having the collar on the one side and the garment on the other side. So you can just pull these slightly away from each other so that there's no little tucks under the binding, and just take it one little section at a time, and then you're pulling the collar and you're making sure the garment is lying nice and flat, and you top stitch all the way around. When you get to the back point, make sure that a tiny little bit of the garment fabric is showing so that your binding is within the inside of the garment and your binding doesn't stick out at that little back point piece when you're looking at it from the right side. When you get to the end of the neck binding, you can just continue top stitching the button band and the hem, whichever hem, whether you did style A or style B. Your original vetiver instructions will guide you there. Once again, just taking one section at a time and using your tailor's ham if you have one. Steam and press. Don't press too vigorously because you don't want your collar to be completely crushed and flat, but just give it a light pressing and a good steam and it will all lie nicely in place. Moving on to the long sleeves, I'm using a different sample here that I sewed. As you can see, it's a different fabric, and I'm hoping the right side and wrong side will show up nicely. Using your interfacing template, you can cut out the interfacing and interface both cuff pieces. Interfacing on the side that has the notch. Using the marking for your sleeve placket slit, we're going to reinforce this before we cut it by sewing a line of stitches. So I'm using a length 2 for the main part of this, and then I'm turning it down to a 1 to do the tip so that it's reinforced, and then I'm going down the other side as well. Now taking the markings for your sleeve pleat, we've got the right side of the fabric facing us, and we're going to fold the pleat towards the slit that we made for the placket. Using a long basting stitch, baste the pleat in place. With the small sharp scissors, cut along the slash line of the sleeve vent. Press the binding for the vent by first pressing it in half along the long edge with the right sides facing out, and then you can unfold it and press in both sides towards the center fold. And then finally press it in half once again. We're going to be placing the right side of the sleeve with the right side of the binding. So you can mark the halfway point of your binding, put the point just inside of that folded line, and then going outward from there, we're going to match the edge of the slash line to the binding edge. Your binding might be longer or shorter depending on how your fabric handles being cut on the bias. So I'm just matching it from the middle outwards and then pinning it in place. Using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which should let your needle fall right into that crease that we folded and pressed. Make sure your binding is lying nice and flat underneath your fabric so that you don't catch it in the seam. When we reach the center, we're going to just catch that little point, and there's going to be a pucker there. So just go right up until just before the little pucker, and then you can also back stitch if you want to reinforce it. And then you're going to turn your fabric so that that little fold is out of the way and behind your needle, and then you can just readjust if you need to. but you don't want any fold in the line of where the needle is going to stitch. Press the seam allowance towards the binding so that the seam line is nice and crisp and flat. And then fold the binding over in half again at the original fold lines that we pressed, and make sure that the edge of the binding, the folded edge, is covering the stitch line of the binding. Press this and pin it in place. Top stitch the binding in place, making sure that you're catching the back of the binding. Fold the binding in half, right sides facing and matching the bottom edges, and then we're going to be sewing at a 45-degree angle at the top point of the binding. While we're here, fold over the binding that is closest to the pleat towards the inside, and then pin it in place. Sew 2 lines of basting stitches on your sleeve head between the circle markings. Sew one line at 1 centimeter and another line at 2 centimeters. We're going to be sewing the seam in between these 2 lines at 1.5 centimeters. Leave your tails long and don't backstitch at the beginning and the end. Use a long basting stitch length. Sew your sleeve seam with a French seam to match the rest of your garment if you chose to do French seams. In order to quickly mark where we're going to fold the uninterfaced edge of the cuff, you can just mark the line at 3 centimeters because we're going to be folding it over at half of that, which is 1.5. Then we can just bring up the raw edge to meet the line that we just made, and I used a friction pen, so as I press this, it's going to disappear. Now taking the right side of the cuff and touching that with the right side of the sleeve, take the notch on the cuff and match it with the sleeve seam notch, with right sides touching. Then take each end of the cuff and pin it to the slit ends. There's going to be a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance left on the cuff. Sew the seam at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and this is what it will look like when it's done. Now we're going to press the seam allowance to the inside of the cuff. Once you've pressed it, you can trim this and grade the seams if your fabric needs it. To close up the ends of the cuff, take them right sides facing and fold it up so that the folded edge is meeting the seam line. Pin each end in place. Once you've sewn those short ends together, you can trim the seam allowances so that it's easier to turn inside out and to work with, and trim the little corner at the bottom. And then using your preferred tool, you can push out the corners so that they are nice and pointy and crisp. Now pin the back of the cuff in place that it's just covering the seam line of the cuff, and we're going to top stitch that from the right side. You can now remove the basting stitches in your pleat. I'm using this white cotton sample again to set in the sleeve because the fabric is much stiffer, so the sleeve is a bit more difficult to ease in, which I thought would be more helpful to demonstrate. So take the shoulder notch of your sleeve and place it right sides together with the shoulder seam of your garment, and then take the sleeve seam and match it with the side seam of your garment. You can nest those two seam allowances together by making them face opposite directions, and this will allow for a much less bulky seam. Now pin the front notches together, the front single notch of your sleeve together with the front single notch of your armhole, and then pin in between those two. And then the same for your back notches, so the double notches on your sleeve and the double notches on your garment. Now we're going to gather the excess fabric that is in the sleeve head to match the size of the armscye. So I'm just gathering a little bit here and then checking if it's going to fit perfectly with the length of the armscye, and it does. So before I do anything else, I'm going to secure those threads. So by working from the wrong side of the fabric, I am using the bobbin threads to pull this and to ease it in. Then I'm going to take that section and just pinch out and even out all of those tiny little gathers. Those gathers are not going to be caught into the seam as gathers, they're going to be eased in and it will be flat. Don't worry at the moment if it looks like there's too many gathers. We're just going to take it very slow and take it one small piece at a time as we sew. So once you've sorted out the one side, we're going to do the exact same on the other side again. We're going to pull those bobbin threads and we're going to match the length of that piece to the length of the armscye. And then once you're happy with those lengths, you can secure the threads with a figure of 8 around your pin so that it doesn't move out of place. And then once that is secured, we're going to once again just take those gathers and even them out as evenly as we possibly can. Now starting at the bottom sleeve seam, stitch at a 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. And then when we get to the gathering bit, you can just take out your pin and start going in between those two lines. You can use an awl or a pin to move along the fabric as you sew. And the thing to watch out for is just your line of stitching where the needle will land. So the fabric on either side, especially on the seam allowance side, is going to be wavy and puckered up. But as long as the line of stitching where your needle will go is lying flat, it doesn't matter what any other of the fabric is doing. So as you get to it, sometimes there'll be a little tuck that's a bit bigger, and then you'll have to just put your needle down, lift up your foot, and redistribute the fabric, and then carry on stitching, making sure just in that stitch line that everything is lying flat. Some fabrics will be a bit more giving and they'll slightly stretch as you sew, and it'll be easier to set in. Other fabrics like the stiffer cotton will be a little bit more tricky, but it's definitely doable. So at no point are you going to catch any of those gathers as a pleat or a tuck in your seam line. You can finish your sleeve seam allowances in whichever method you prefer. I'm just doing a quick zigzag on the sewing machine here, or you can overlock it, or whichever method you usually use for finishing your raw edges. I've also trimmed my seam allowances before I use the zigzag stitch finished. Remove your remaining line of basting stitches. So just take one little section at a time. I'm once again using my tailor's ham to help me, and we are ironing the seam allowance of the sleeve towards the sleeve. And last but certainly not least, remember when you are doing your buttonholes and buttons on your main garment to do your buttons and buttonholes on your sleeve cuffs as well.